Now briefly, if I may, I just wanted to, because I do come back from a public philosophy background with this. This is the Canadian philosopher James Tully, who basically has a few main assumptions coming from a critical philosophy. He focuses on struggles for recognition by a multiplicity of agents. Of course, the Canadian context is conducive to this. In climate Arctic governance, for example, we can see that Canada is one of the countries that is most familiar with negotiating the norm of sovereignty, for example, reconciliation, issues of First Nations, different types of nations when it comes to Arctic governance. So that's a context that's conducive to think about that. And the shift then is towards the importance of local knowledge, the way how local knowledge formation takes place. And we look at this with regard to the norms in a given order and how that order develops. The principle that is taken from economic governance is the quod omnis tangit principle, which means what touches all must also be approved by all in principle. We do know that it's not obviously possible in global society, but in principle, this helps us to understand why those affected without a say might eventually reject the norms where they don't share the meaning or the interpretation. So the approach is conclusive, inclusive, and the assumption is that all affected stakeholders ought to have access to contest the norms that govern them. That is different from what we hear mostly about in governance programs and what students are often taught in the context of the global liberal order. In this approach, diversity is analytically prior to community. So we are not talking about a given community, but the key thing in world politics, and it has been a key thing for hundreds of years, not just since a few colleagues or a majority of colleagues is beginning to realize that the liberal order does not work. Because through processes of colonization and so on, the United Nations system has always been exclusive to a certain extent and always been a kind of a Northwestern model. So secondly, the order of a community is contested through practice, and that's how we can understand how orders work together, how orders stabilize through practice, and with that, the normative legitimacy of the type of order is growing. I will briefly, I've been asked to talk about the background of norms research is a field that's already been developed for about 2 decades, and researchers focus on different definitions of norms and logics, and accordingly on different types of stakeholders. And this leads us in a moment straight into where cyberspace governance is located. So if we look at the definitions, I distinguish, drawing on Jimena's excellent paper for the UN headquarters in December, on regulatory norms, strategic and decolonial. And so if you look at the regulatory norms, these regulatory norms work in a quasi-constitutional order. It's that liberal order that is so, has come to represent the United Nations system, where the main places where we interact are international, or where states interact, are international organizations. Now, the strategic definition of norms that's kind of the constructivist move towards a political order in a given community, but it's still the liberal and what coming from constitutionalism we would call a modern constitutional setting that is, it is governed by the principles and norms and values of the liberal order of the North or West, where everybody knows that these geopolitical assignments don't work particularly well, and that's why these norms are often highly contested and misunderstood. And the decolonial, the last one, and I think I picked up that term from Jimena as well. The decolonial looks at knowledge-based orders in communities of practice, and that's very much reflecting a movement in practice theory and knowledge formation and worlding sort of based on emerging orders that starts from local sites of contestation. It's a relatively broad trend in international relations theory, and I will flesh this out for you in the next slide. Let me just before distinguish the logics again. In the regulatory, we assume that certain norms, like especially in international law, work in a top-down fashion. The strategic is very similar, and I refer to the practices that involves in a moment, whereas the decolonial tries to focus on bottom-up. Of course, that's a huge task because you always have the field doesn't look as neatly organized as when you have states represent stakeholders. But we know that in the current global order, we just can't rely on stakeholders being represented in a meaningful way. So if we take this now to the practices and who's actually operating on which sides, then with the regulatory, we are looking at norms as obligations, prohibitions, standards, and procedures, which are set and you know, framed in law and then implemented. And this looks like the principles that we use in IR theory would here be norm setting or international law. The other one is norm diffusion, that also became a term that was became quite dominant. It's kind of a policy term which looks at spreading norms from the center to the periphery, often in a north-south fashion. And I think an example that we all in Europe remember quite well is European enlargement, spreading norms from the west to the east on the basis of the Copenhagen criteria. From my critical perspective, I think that was one of the worst examples that we had, and it led to many misunderstandings, and it should not be used as a blueprint for any other global governance processes, as just suggested. I read it in the papers yesterday by a German politician, Vogel. I don't think that's a good idea because it's a unilinear spreading of norms where stakeholders are clearly not involved in generating the meanings or establishing the norms. So this again is international organizations. We work with the traditional instruments of conventions, agreements, council conclusions, declarations, and so on. The strategic is, again, the move into constructivism, at sort of the first generation, as it's often called, liberal constructivism, where we include norms as social facts to the politics of international relations that work more with material facts, tanks, and so on, power. And this is about the unwritten, robust rules that also influence state behavior. This is then norm implementation through policy and law, norm diffusion through politics, and also norm change from a sociological perspective. It's carried out, and it's very important, the underlying assumption of this constructivist approach is that we are still moving in a liberal, modern, constitutional setting that works. That is an uncontested assumption where states and non-state actors work as norm entrepreneurs and have an interest in implementing the norm. Now, when we move towards the decolonial, then norms are considered not just as facts, but also as values, and it's really important. Values that are coming from the bottom up and which are very localized and which are often carried individually, but we need to get an understanding of what values are. And that's where norm contestation comes in when we move to the knowledge-based orders that take into account different meanings of norms that are knowledge-based and local. So we're looking at local sites of contestation where affected stakeholders interact.